The day after tomorrow, the government's expected to announce that Britain is going nuclear again. The Cabinet is said to have decided today that a new generation of nuclear reactors is the only way to keep the lights on and still meet ambitions to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Environmental campaigners, and we'll hear from a couple of them shortly, are disillusioned and angry. First tonight, our science editor, Susan Watts, reports.
The nuclear industry has been stepping up the pressure. It's time, they say, to give the nuclear option a chance. And the government seems to be calling their bluff, shooting the starting gun for new nuclear build in the UK. Now, the rest of the world can sit back and watch how many new power stations actually get built, who stumps up the cash, and how long it takes. The Dungeness B nuclear power station here on the Kent coast demonstrates the nuclear industry's problems. It holds the world record as the nuclear power station longest in construction, 23 years. Work began here in 1965, yet it wasn't commercially running until 1989. The government says we need a whole new generation of nuclear power stations to maintain Britain's energy security, and without it, we won't meet our climate change targets. But is either proposition true, and how much is all this going to cost the rest of us? At his monthly press conference this morning, we asked Gordon Brown what fresh incentives he'll offer the industry to build new nuclear power stations. He didn't say.
I think it's difficult for me to preempt an announcement that will be made to the House of Commons, but I think I can say to you that all the details of what the nuclear programme would look like if we went ahead with it will be announced on Thursday by John Hutton. So this is a very comprehensive announcement that will look at all aspects of the nuclear industry.
The practical problem of building nuclear power stations shouldn't be underestimated. There's now reportedly a 3-year backlog for reactor pressure vessels. This is one of only 2 sites in the world where they're built, the Arriva plant in France. There's also a worldwide shortage of skilled nuclear engineers, all of which is pushing up the estimated capital cost of new build. The government's own consultation conceded that even if an order were placed today, it could be 8 years before construction began. If it takes an optimistic 5 years to build, it would still be 2021 before we had our first new nuclear power station, when the government expects the so-called energy gap to start kicking in years before that. The energy security argument also says that nuclear new build can make us less dependent on imported oil and gas. The problem with that argument is that most of Britain's oil is used in transport, so can't be replaced by nuclear electricity. And around half of our gas is used to heat domestic homes and water, so again can't be replaced by nuclear electricity. And even the government's own advisers say the electricity capacity nuclear power could provide in the future is extremely limited.
If you wanted to replace the current nuclear plants with new build nuclear plant, you could probably just about do that by, say, 2024. But having done that, you've then achieved a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions of only about 4%. So it's a limited contribution to a very significant task. But you've chosen a technology to do that, which has a very, very long legacy in terms of waste, in terms of decommissioning issues, and potentially in terms of its implications for nuclear proliferation at the international level.
Green groups argue that spending money on nuclear diverts resources from renewable technologies and energy efficiency that could cut our carbon footprint faster and more cheaply. And it's hard to see why the government's reluctant to spend more on carbon capture and storage, a technology that could make coal power stations cleaner here, but more importantly could provide a blueprint for China, where the real problem lies. China's explosive economic growth will be built on coal for many decades to come. There's no sense that Thursday's announcement includes new plans to store radioactive waste. The French still stick it in barrels in giant concrete bunkers. And no sign of new plans for safer, cheaper reactors or how to guarantee the taxpayer won't end up bailing out the industry. But nuclear power supporters say it's a new world now.
Whatever you think of nuclear, civil nuclear power as an absolute, its role is changed once you take the whole climate change, global warming debate into account. And what we were being asked to do was to allow nuclear power, which is our one significant source of carbon-free electricity at present, simply to wither on the vine, so that everything we did in renewables for the next 20, 30 years, and I'm in favour of doing everything we possibly can in renewables, would simply be cancelled out by the loss of the nuclear contribution.
So what will the government actually announce on Thursday? It'll be laughed out of court if all it says is nuclear power, yes please. And given that the industry hasn't been exactly rushing to build nuclear power stations so far, they'll need some fairly hefty incentives to change that. With talk of waste hotels in which the industry can rent space and a minimum carbon price so the industry can trade cuts in emissions on the carbon markets, it's these hidden subsidies that critics will be looking out for on Thursday. Of course, the Treasury will have to approve any such spending. So at the end of the day, it all boils down, as ever, to how much a nuclear future will cost and who ends up paying.
We're going to start off talking about that now with Tom Burke of the environmental consultancy E3G, Bernard Ingham of the Supporters of Nuclear Energy, Zach Goldsmith of The Ecologist and also a Tory candidate, and David Porter, who's the Chief Executive of the Association of Electricity Producers. David Porter, how much public money do you want to build nuclear power stations?
We're not looking for public money at all. That's a big point to make, that this is not the government building nuclear power stations. There are many large electricity companies that want to invest private money in new nuclear power for good reasons, among them being diversity for our energy supply.
Do you believe him, Tom Burke?
Not really. I think the government's probably going to cheat on the no subsidies pledge. There's been nothing that stopped anybody who wanted to build a nuclear power station in this country at any time at all in the last few years, so it's very difficult to know what the government's deciding. If people thought it was economic to build a nuclear power station, they'd have done so. Nothing has changed except the cost has gone up. It now costs about $6,000 a kilowatt to build a nuclear power station.
Bernard Ingham, why, haven't they been building them anyway?
Well, the government has not exactly been in favour of it, has it? It hasn't even licensed a reactor yet. It's sat for 12 months on money to appoint inspectors in order to license reactors. There's been no preparation.
So you say there would be no call on public funds?
No, the industry is not looking for a subsidy at all. It's the most economic means of generating electricity.
Just, Zach Goldsmith, where are you on this question of whether there would be a necessary public subvention?
Well, I mean, there never has been a nuclear power plant ever built without government subsidies, so I don't know whether this optimism comes from.
Is that true? Is that right?
I think that's probably true, but we're looking...
So every single president argues against what you've just said.
We're looking at new nuclear projects run by companies that are confident that given the a stable political environment, they can go ahead and do this on a commercial basis.
That is a heck of an argument you've just adduced. There isn't a single one built anywhere in the world?
There isn't a single bit of renewables that's been built without a massive subsidy, which we are paying through the nose.
No, but that's not the argument. Mr. Porter's argument was that there was no public subsidy necessary.
Well,
he just conceded there isn't a single one built in the world which hasn't had a public subsidy.
Well, what about Finland? They're building one there.
I don't know. What about Finland?
What about Finland? It's 2 years late. It's only been under construction for 2 years. It's 25% over budget, and its cost is now about £1 billion more than they anticipated.
And it will go for 60 years, and over that period it will be incredibly profitable.
Plus, it's worth pointing out that in America there's been a nuclear green light by various administrations for 30 years, and not a single plant has been built. And in order to kickstart the industry now, they have offered an unprecedented suite of subsidies. 80% of project costs are guaranteed by the government. I could go on and on with the subsidies being offered.
So you want the lights to go out, do you?
Well, I think if it comes to a question of how the government should spend taxpayers' money, it needs to spend it on whatever is going to deliver the most cost-effective energy. That's never going to be
well, let's
nuclear power.
engage with this question of the energy gap, because that's what this is really about. Is there any other way of meeting the energy gap?
It's not just about nuclear power. Our electricity companies need to spend between 20 and 30 billion pounds at least in the next 12 years on new power stations, simply because stations are closing for old age and the nuclear ones are scheduled to close. This is big money, and they haven't invested in nuclear power up until now because we've had a succession of energy reviews. Nobody is going to make a very large, long-term commitment to nuclear power if they're not sure that the politics of it are going to be stable.
Bernard put it very pithily. Would you rather the lights went out?
Yeah.
Is there an alternative?
And Bernard was the person who first put that argument into Mrs. Thatcher's mouth in the 80s, and all that happened was the one reactor, not the 10 reactors that she promised in order to avoid the lights
Actually,
going out.
that is quite an interesting point. Why, Mrs. Thatcher wanted 10 built, and there was only one built,
And
wasn't
the
there?
lights didn't go out.
Well, what happened?
Sizewell B was built, and I think that
Yes.
what happened was that we were awash. Coal, oil and
Didn't need
gas
to
was
build.
coming out of our ears, and it was as cheap as sin.
Actually, the really important thing about the energy gap argument is the government's own consultation document says that you can't expect any nuclear electricity to be appearing in Britain before 2021, and that the energy gap will appear, if it appears at all, around 2016.